John Krasinski's new movie If had a lot of potential and it definitely had its moments, but in my opinion, I think it missed the mark a little bit. So let's talk about it. As always, this video will have spoilers, so if you don't want spoilers, head over to my shorts, TikTok, or Instagram and check out my one-take movie review on this movie. But without further ado, let's talk about If. So this movie is obviously directed by John Krasinski, and it has a super cool premise, even though it is eerily similar to Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends. But anyways, it has a really cool message in it about holding on to your inner child, but I just don't think they really delivered on that. So in this movie, we follow a young girl named Bee, who is played by Kaylee Fleming, and when she discovers she can see forgotten imaginary friends, or IFs, she teams up with Ryan Reynolds' character, who is known as Cal in this movie, and they set out to find new kids for these imaginary friends. Starting things off with the good, and the first thing I have here is of course Ryan Reynolds and Kaylee Fleming, and I'll start with Ryan Reynolds here, but he was his usual self in this film. He was charismatic and he was just naturally funny, as he always is. Now he is one of the main reasons why I went to go see this movie, and yes, I may be a little biased here, but you won't hear me say that I dislike very many Ryan Reynolds performances. Did he just play Ryan Reynolds like he always does? Yes, but I enjoyed it, so that's all that matters at the end of the day. I also really liked his co-star and really the lead of this film in Kaylee Fleming, even though I do wish they did a little bit more with her character, because she had quite a few emotional moments in this film that I think would have hit a little bit harder if they did just a few more things with her character. But all in all, a lot of this movie rested on her shoulders. She had to carry a majority of the load in this thing, and she did a really good job at that. Her character was really charming, especially when we saw her hanging out with the IFs, and you could just tell that she really liked working with Ryan Reynolds because they worked really well together in this movie, and that's why they were a big highlight of this film for me. Next up for the good is that this movie had some pretty cool visuals, and obviously the imaginary friends were all done with CGI, and for the most part they looked really good, and they interacted with our human characters pretty well too. There wasn't very many times where the special effects really distracted you in this film, and on top of that, this film was also just very colorful and vibrant throughout this whole thing, and the more I think about it, that was probably done on purpose because again, this is geared towards kids, and kids tend to like colorful and vibrant things. But one thing I didn't expect is that some of the shots in this film just had really beautiful framing. For example, there was that scene where Bee was eating pizza with her grandmother, and they were just framed up perfectly in between the windows. You had the light coming through the windows a little bit, but they were mainly lit by that lamp that was sitting at the center of the table, and I just thought that was really cool. And I don't know if pointing that out really means much to you, but being a guy that wants to hopefully make some of these movies one day, I always like looking for that stuff, and I always appreciate it when it's done well. Moving on to the so-so, and the first thing I have here is the story. Now, let me start this by saying, yes, I know this is a kid's movie, so I wasn't expecting this super deep, fleshed out story, but man, the more I think about this film, the more I think about how much potential this story had. I mean, the way this movie started with Bee's mom dying and now her dad is in that same hospital, I was like, man, this is about to be a tearjerker of a movie. But then it really just didn't do much with that storyline, and that storyline didn't play as much as a role as I thought it would in the main story. Now, this story did jump around from place to place, and it did have its fair share of plot holes, and that is something that I will touch on in just a sec, but I also think this thing could have been just a bit deeper in its story. Now, let me reiterate that yes, I get this is a kid's movie, so I'm not expecting this thing to have a super deep and rich story. But given that this movie tried to and wanted to have a bunch of emotional and heartwarming moments, I think if they just would have went a teeny bit deeper than they did with this story, then those moments when they happened would have worked a little bit better in my opinion. Now, don't get me wrong, this story definitely had its moments and it does pull on your heartstrings just a little bit, but as I said before, I just think this story is a super cool premise that wasn't executed all that well. Next for the so-so, I have the humor, and overall the humor was fine in this movie. I think the funniest characters were either Ryan Reynolds or Steve Carell's character Blue, who looks strangely like Grimace from McDonald's in this movie. And I'll be honest, yes, not all of the jokes landed for me, but this humor was obviously geared more towards kids and family fun. So at the end of the day, if it made the kids laugh, then I guess it did its job. But for me, just looking at it through adult eyes, it didn't always work for me. Yes, it had a couple moments where I did laugh, but other jokes didn't work so well. And finally, getting into the bad, and the first thing I have here is something I briefly mentioned before, but yes, this story did have its fair share of plot holes, and I think that's because this story did jump around quite a bit from place to place, and it didn't really take the time to explain some things. And I'll keep saying this, yes, it was a kids movie, and I can usually get over plot holes when it comes to me watching kids movies, but there was one big glaring plot hole that I just couldn't stop thinking about throughout this entire film. Now, obviously, one of the big things in this movie is that when kids forget their imaginary friends, they can no longer see them. But with Ryan Reynolds being Bee's imaginary friend, I was just thinking throughout this whole movie, how can she see him and really all the other imaginary friends when she forgot who hers was? And I'm not trying to dig too deep into this movie and really rip it apart, because honestly, you could really do that with any movie to ever exist, but that just seems like a big glaring plot hole that went unaddressed. And finally, for the bad, is that this movie really had no stakes in it. And I bring that up because this is a movie that wanted to have a bunch of heartwarming and emotional moments, and when you have no stakes in your movie, in my opinion, those moments don't hit as hard as they should. And with the way the story was going, with them trying to reunite people and get them to remember their imaginary friends, I feel like they could have easily incorporated some stakes with the imaginary friends themselves. For instance, what if when a kid fully forgot their imaginary friend, then that imaginary friend disappeared forever? And I think if they would have incorporated something like that, then it would have put some more urgency into them finding a new kid or getting their old kid to remember them so they don't disappear. So when we finally got to those moments when the kids remembered their old imaginary friend, I think those would have hit a little bit harder, and as an audience, we would have felt a sense of relief because that imaginary friend will no longer be forgotten and disappear forever. And before you say, hey, that's a little dark for a kids film to be essentially killing these imaginary friends, I would say to that in 2015, Inside Out did this perfectly with Bing Bong, and that was one of the most memorable parts of that movie, which is a movie that is regarded as one of the best Pixar films of all time. And given that this movie wanted to pull on your heartstrings a bit, I think introducing some stakes would have definitely helped with that. So at the end of the day, even though this movie does have its moments, I think it had much more potential with the premise that it had. And don't get me wrong, I really wanted to like this movie, but this is probably a film that you can wait to watch on streaming. Those are my thoughts on If. Be sure to let me know what you thought of the movie down in the comments, and as always, be sure to like, subscribe, comment, get your Eazy Apparel at shopeasyapparel.com. God bless, and I'll see you guys later. Peace.